Hi everyone. Spring is in the air this week in Barcelona, right? Welcome to this talk. I'm happy to see a big number of you. I'd like to, it's great to be here at Spring I/O. It's such a great event with many high profile speakers and great content, so I really appreciate each of you coming and picking this session instead of some other, because I know the choice isn't easy one. Okay, introducing Spring Session 2. Before we start, a few questions for you in the audience. How many of you have been using Spring Session already? Okay, I expected more hands. Anyone using Spring Session 2 already? Nope. Okay, that's good. And okay, so regarding the session stores, what do you use? Redis, who uses Redis? Okay, Hazelcast, anyone? Okay, JDBC? Okay, anyone using some third-party session repository or their own? You do? Okay, there is some interesting content for you as well, or for others who are considering providing their own session repository. Okay, here's the agenda of today's talk. In the beginning, I'm gonna briefly introduce myself. After that, we're gonna cover what's the new stuff in Spring Session 2. And basically, the new stuff in Spring Session 2 can be divided in three major topics. The first one is the changes to project structure, which reflects to project's modules. We've done quite a lot of changes with the new major release. The other hot topic of Spring Session 2 was the introduction of support for reactive programming model, which is a support for Spring WebFlux. Anyone using Spring WebFlux? Okay, a couple of brave ones, yeah. And the third point will be general overview of general improvements that we provided in Spring Session 2. All those little things that make your life easier as a developer. After that, we're going to cover critical points for migrating from Spring Session 1 to Spring Session 2. And we're going to cover the topic of providing a custom session repository implementation together with the supporting configuration infrastructure. Basically, we'll have some demos, so hopefully you'll enjoy the talk. About me, my name is Vedran Pavić. I come from Croatia. I've been a Spring user for 9 years now. I have experience with Spring starting with, I don't know, Spring 1.2, something like that, CG security and that level. So it's been cool to grow as a developer and engineer together with Spring. It's been many years of using Spring, and for the last 2.5 years, I've become quite active in the Spring community as a contributor, most notably to Spring Session, obviously, but also to other projects like Spring Boot, Spring Security, Spring Integration, and the like. And for the last year and a half, I've been a committer on Spring Session. Spring Session is a project that is a part of Spring Security group within Spring team. It is led by Rob Winch, who is the founder of this project, so I believe you've all heard of Rob. And other than that, I'm open source enthusiast, Java, Spring, Linux. Those are the technologies I like, and that's it. Okay, project modules. So those of you who used Spring Session 1 are probably aware that actually Spring Session 1 was, the project structure was such that it was a single jar arrangement. By that, I mean that all the Spring Session core APIs, all the Spring Session repository implementations, they were all placed in the same jar, right? Okay, we had some other modules, but those weren't carrying any code. Those were just like dependency aggregator modules, similar to the arrangement Spring Boot has with their starters I believe you are familiar with the concept of starters in Spring Boot. Well, this was convenient because regardless of the repository that you use, you only needed to have a single dependency. Going forward and evolving the project was challenging in such arrangement because, well, with all the session repository implementations in single jar, that puts a strain on maintainers to know in and outs of every data store, which isn't an easy task to do. We are generally, as developers, most of us are focused on specific data stores. We don't know in and outs of all of them. So early on, Spring Session had quite an ambitious goal of providing all sorts of session repository. Spring Session 1 in this, like I mentioned, single jar had support for Redis, MongoDB, Gemfire, JDBC, Hazelcast. And we had an ongoing pull request to add support for Cassandra and CouchDB and possibly something else, and a ton of issues to add support for even more repositories. So this whole arrangement actually hurt us in a way that we couldn't focus on developing core Spring Session features, right? Most of our time, us as maintainers, was consumed by providing support for all the session repositories, merging pull requests for new session repos and the like. So with Spring Session 2, we decided to split things apart. By that, we are making it a jar per session store arrangement. So we have Spring Session Core, which is like central module, and this module carries the core Spring Session APIs. And this is coupled by a number of other modules which are specifically focused to one session repository implementation. So this arrangement is somewhat familiar to one that you know from Spring Data. Spring Data, I assume most of you use Spring Data, right? Yeah. So Spring Data has this Spring Data Commons module, and then they have Spring Data, I don't know, JPA, MongoDB, Redis, and so on, and so on, and so on. So we're doing something like that, something similar with starting with Spring Session 2. So as a part of this, split, we've also removed some of the supported session repositories, such as Gemfire and MongoDB, from the main Spring Session repo, and those are now handled in an external repo. We also welcome and encourage community to take on the development of third-party session repository implementations. We encourage those by promoting them through dedicated section of our reference manual. So if you do have your own session repository implementation, get in touch with us, and if you want to get it promoted through our reference manual. And finally, this split had some impact on Spring Boot and initializer, that is start.spring.io. With Spring Boot, previously with Spring Session 1, you needed to, if you wanted to use Boot's auto configuration facilities for Spring Session, you needed to declare this application property spring.session.store type, right? Because with all the session repository implementations placed in a single jar, Spring Boot couldn't deduce by itself which one do you really intend to use. So the nice side effect of splitting Spring Session to multiple modules was that now Spring Boot, sorry, if you place a single session repository jar on a class path like you typically do, Spring Boot is actually able to deduce what you want to use and is able to auto-configure it without you providing this store type property. On the other hand, start.spring.io has a different arrangement. Previously, it was fairly easy to get going with Spring Session. You only needed to pick Spring Session in initializer. But nowadays, you need to pick a dedicated store that you intend to use. For example, you need to pick Spring Data Redis. You need to pick Redis, and you need to pick Spring Session. When you do that, initializer will realize that you are interested in Redis support for Spring Session. If you pick, let's say, relational database and Redis, then initializer will pull both modules for Spring Session because it doesn't know which one you intend to use. So keep that in mind. And that might be the reason if you create a Spring Boot app using initializer and you declare that you use relational database and Redis, and you don't get Spring Session auto-configured without the main session store type property, because now you have 2 session repos on the class path, right? So you need to remove the one that you're not using. Okay, so to put things a bit more visual, this is the arrangement with Spring Session 1. So we've got this Spring Session module, which carries all the Spring Session core, and like we mentioned, implementations all over the session repos: Redis, Gemfire, MongoDB, JDBC, Hazelcast. The other listed modules are simply dependency aggregators, like starter modules in the same manner like Spring Boot starters are. On the other hand, with Spring Session 2, we've split it to multiple repos. So the main Spring Session repo still carries, produces several artifacts. This is Spring Session Core, Spring Session Data Redis, Spring Session JDBC, and Hazelcast. So these are all produced by the main Spring Session repo. On the other hand, we've got Spring Session Data Geode, which produces Data Geode and Data Gemfire Spring Session modules, and we've got Spring Session Data MongoDB repo which produces this MongoDB jar. To finally round up the story with separation, there is one aspect to this. With splitting to multiple repos, all the releases don't happen at the same time anymore, and each of these repos might release new versions at a different pace. So we needed to introduce a simpler and more reliable way for you to track your dependencies, so we decided to introduce a BOM module. Anyone familiar with the BOM concept? Maven BOM, bill of material. Basically, this is like Spring Boot dependencies module, which is also a BOM. It covers all the dependencies of Spring Boot. We do the same for Spring Session modules. Okay, and one important thing as a side effect of this also influences where do you report issues or submit pull requests or anything like that. So now you have, instead of one repo, you have several. So keep that in mind when you're reporting issues. Okay, so another major point of Spring Session 2 was introduction of Spring WebFlux support, the reactive programming model. So this follows the familiar and well-known patterns with Spring Session. So just like you were using enable Redis HTTP session annotation, now we have enable Redis web session. So the naming is fairly consistent with the previous arrangement. HTTP session part should suggest that you're configuring support for Servlet APIs. HTTP session, on the other hand, web session suggests that this is Spring Web's web session, which is used in Spring WebFlux. And compared to the Servlet API support that we had in Spring 1.x, actually Spring Session 1 was all about Servlet API, right? We only provided clustering and support for HTTP session, which is a part of Servlet API spec. And to give you some description of how things work inside of Spring Session, there are basically two core concepts when you're managing sessions. One is the session repo, which is like the central point. We need to provide our internal representation of the session together with a repository that is used to store it and then retrieve it afterwards. And the other important piece of the story is the strategy to correlate users' requests with session. So that can be done by means of session cookie, our HTTP header that communicates the session. So with servlet support, actually, it was much more complex arrangement than it is with WebFlux, because in servlet world we have on top of Servlet API, right, which provides us HTTP session and HTTP session HTTP servlet request, which is used to obtain the session. This is up here, and down there is our session repository from Spring Session, right? So everything in between is provided by Spring Session. The entry point to Spring Session world is session repository filter, which needs to be placed at top or near the top of your filter chain. So this filter then, in turn, it wraps a request and uses this mentioned strategy of correlating the user's request with using cookie or header to session on the server. And the other part is that this filter communicates with our session repo to store and retrieve the sessions. With Spring WebFlux support, things are far simpler, because actually we are not integrated with, there is no, Servlet API is Java EE standard, right? There is no equivalent thing for reactive. Reactive support in Spring WebFlux is based in Spring. So all the major concepts like web session and web session manager, web session store, web session ID resolver, those are all parts of Spring Web module, which is used by Spring WebFlux, right? So our life is much more easier integrating with Spring WebFlux than it was with Servlet API. We'll show that in a demo. And finally, starting with Spring 2, we have a Redis-based and MongoDB-based implementation of reactive session repositories. More are scheduled to come. I know we have an open ticket to add support for Hazelcast, but I think that's blocked on Hazelcast adopting Java 8 and making our integration easier. Okay, so it's time for the first demo. Now we can take a look briefly at the Spring Sessions reference manual and web session integration section. What it suggests to us to start using Spring Session WebFlux support. So two major points: add enable session repo. Is this? Do you see it? Do I need to zoom in further? Not zoom out, but zoom in. Okay, so we add enable Redis web session annotation, and then we register a Redis connection factory bin. So let's take a look at first demo. We're using starter for WebFlux, starter for data Redis reactive, starter for security, and Spring Session data Redis. Our main class looks something like this. So we have a controller endpoint that will return session ID, and we are doing everything as in the manual, right? So now let's start this. Okay, we should be running. Sorry, I started the wrong demo. It should be the WebFlux one. It's again, sorry. Okay. So we're greeted with a login page after we log in. We get the session ID. Okay, this is it. We can check what's going on in Redis. So we've got some keys in there. And our session is key B76, something like that. So this is, we can see that we've got Spring Security's security context, some other attributes, and our session is indeed stored in Redis. So we can also see that when we flush the Redis, our session is destroyed and we are again prompted to log in. So let's take a look at the code involved from Spring Session side. Entry point is, of course, this enable Redis web session annotation. And this in turn, the key point here is that it imports Redis web session configuration. This class registers reactive Redis operations session repository, and basically it handles all the Redis specific parts of the configuration. But what we are interested here is the common infrastructure of Spring Session, which is contained in Spring web session configuration class, which this Redis specific one extends. And we can see that this is really very simple. All we do here is register web session manager. Web session manager is central management point in Spring WebFlux, and it's part of Spring Web, as you can see. And basically, all the involved parts, this web session ID resolver, which is the strategy that I've mentioned for correlating the request with session on server side, it's also provided by Spring WebFlux. So what you need to do to customize the strategy used, the resolver used, is to provide a Spring Web component. There is very little that we had to do from Spring Session side to integrate with WebFlux. Earlier, in the early milestones of 2.0 release, actually more code was placed in Spring Session repo. However, as the session support in Spring WebFlux evolved, by much input of Rob Winch and his experiences with Spring Session, the API that was established in Spring Web is very easy for us to integrate from Spring Session side. So now that we've taken a look at the code involved, do you think this is a lot of code? But it's too much, right? Good developers are lazy. We don't want to have much code. So this is Spring Boot up, right? So we don't need this. It will auto-configure Redis for us, right? And as a matter of fact, we don't need this either, because Spring Boot also provides auto-configuration support for Spring Session. This coupled with the fact that we have only one session, Spring Session jar with session repository implementation of the class path means that Spring Boot is able to auto-configure Spring WebFlux session support by only providing this dependency. So no code involved, no application properties. As you can see, we're only configuring password, and no code whatsoever in this app involving Spring Session, right? So let's start this again. In the meantime, we're gonna flush the Redis and verify that it's empty. Wrong demo again. Okay. Okay, this is it. Now we'll take a look at Redis again, and our session is here, right? It's this one. Okay. So simple enough. Sorry, we can't go much simpler than that. Any questions regarding demo, WebFlux support? No? Okay. So going further, we've introduced several improvements to the existing Spring Session support that we have. For starters, basically all the projects that were released, that released a new major version after Spring 5, Spring Framework 5 went GA late September, did pick up the same requirements, that is Java 8 and Spring 5 itself as a baseline. So we did the same in Spring Session 2, to no surprise. We've also used the chance to, moving to Java 8 and having a new major list, we use this chance to refresh some of the core APIs within a Spring Session. So those of you who used Spring Session before, you are aware that our internal representation of session consisted of session and expiring session, right? This was, our model was split in two interfaces, with expiring session containing all of the access to session properties related to session expiry. Since in practice all of the session repository implementations implemented the expiring session, we decided to merge it into one. So all that was previously contained in all the APIs from expiring session were moved to session. So this is now a simpler arrangement. We also made use of java.time, and we've improved our APIs a bit. We've also aligned Spring Sessions session repository API to align better with what you'd expect from Spring Data repository. And finally, among core API changes, we provided implementation for HTTP servlet requests change session ID operation. Previously, Spring Session had done deletion of old session and creation of new, which as side effect caused session events to be triggered. But now with native change session ID implementation, this isn't the case anymore. We've also provided some nice to have configuration improvements. For example, like support for Servlet APIs session cookie config. The net effect of this is that in Spring Boot Up, for example, you can now configure session cookie attributes using servlet session or something like that set of application properties. We'll show this in a demo. And with introduction of Spring WebFlux support, we'll also took a chance to align some of the old APIs with WebFlux support. So we had previously HTTP session strategy API for correlating user requests with servers, with sessions on the server side. Now we've made this strategy solely about session ID resolution. So it's direct counterpart of Web Session ID Resolver from Spring Web. We've also done some improvements to repositories. For instance, we've been able to do some significant performance improvements for JDBC and Hazelcast session repositories, as interaction with session repo is fairly critical since it occurs multiple times during the lifetime of a HTTP request. Any performance improvement is a nice benefit. We also provided support for some of the configuration scenarios that were presented to us by the community. Basically, we provided support for you to easily select data store that you are interested in for purpose of storing sessions. For example, in your application, you might have two data sources or two Redis connection factories, but you only want one of them to be used for a Spring Session, right? So this arrangement in Spring Session 1 required some manual configuration. Now we've introduced qualifier annotations for simplifying this use case. And we've also made changes to our configurations that involve us being more friendly to application context of your application. Previously, we registered appropriate data access related beans to the context that were used by Spring Session repositories. For example, with Redis support, this was naturally Redis template. With JDBC, this was JDBC templates. For this, while convenient, it caused unintended side effects for some users because you weren't sure which Redis bean are you supposed to use. You might have your own one or the one provided by Spring Boot or something else, and now all out of somewhere came another Redis template or JDBC template that was in application context. So you had to resort either to use it primary annotations or something like that. So we've removed those registrations and simplified that use case. So now we're gonna take another demo, which will hopefully show you some of these improvements. Now, regarding dependencies that we use in this demo, we are going back to good old Servlet support. And our sample application consists of the following. It's, again, very simple app. We rely on Boot's auto configuration. What we do for start, we only use servlet session cookie name application property to configure a custom name for our session cookie. Okay, let's take a look how this works. We're gonna first clear the session store. Okay. Oops, sorry. Now if you go to demo, we should first delete the existing cookies. Okay, we are greeted with a login form again. And now when we log in, we can see down here that our session cookie is indeed named demo session as we've configured. So this covers the support for session cookie configuration from Servlet API. Now we might as well demo the case with multiple Redis connection factories. So for this, we're going to enable this configuration class, which basically all it does is registers two beans, two Redis connection factory beans, one connecting to localhost 6379 and the other one to 6378. So what do you expect here to happen? Anyone? Will this work? No? Only one brave voice. Let's check it. Okay. Spring Session configuration doesn't know which one to inject. Okay, we can easily move past that by annotating one of the two as primary, right? This should work, right? Okay. Check the session store. Let's clear it first. The other one is clear as well. Okay, so we can now log in. And it works. We annotated the 6379 one as primary, so we expect our session to be stored in here, right? And this one is still empty. But this might not be what we actually want. We want our primary Redis connection factories to be used across our application, but for Spring Session purposes, we want this other one, right? So to support this use case, we've added a qualifier annotation, Spring Session Redis connection factories. So this signals to Spring Session that this, in case of multiple Redis connection factory beans are present, this is the one to inject in Spring Session configuration. So let's double check how that works. We're gonna clear the verify that both are clear. Okay. Now we can simply log in again. And we see that the primary one is empty and the other one contains our session, right? So this is what we wanted, and we got it with a simple single annotation. Okay, so now you might ask, okay, you guys removed this. You removed the registration of Redis template that you were using, but actually I was doing some custom interaction with Spring Session repository. I would like to be able to do that again, right? So since we don't have that being registered in the context anymore, we've added qualifier annotation for injecting Redis template that is used by Spring Session repository into your application. So for that purpose, we've introduced add Spring Session Redis operation annotation. So to demo that, I've just injected it into our demo app and provided another endpoint which will just list all the keys from underlying session store. But to do so, we'll use the Spring Session specific Redis template. Okay, since I didn't flush the Redis stores, the existing sessions should still work. We can double check the output of listing all the keys. It has 5 keys now, right? So when we go to this keys endpoint, we can see that we exactly got that back using the Spring Sessions Redis template bin. Okay, any questions on these demos? Yeah? Okay, which one? This last one? Yeah, this one is actually, it resolves, okay, the story goes something like this. We have a Redis operation session repository. It has a, oops, sorry. It has a getter for Redis session operation. It's this one, right? So in turn, we have annotation that's annotated with @value session repository this property. Actually very simple, but makes your life easier. And regarding the support for multiple Redis factory beans, Redis connection factory beans, this is simply a qualifier, meta annotation for qualifier. And in turn, we search for this annotation in Spring Session configuration. If we find it, we said, okay, this is the thing that we want to eject. Okay. Let's head back to the presentation. Okay, so migrating to Spring Session 2, basically we've talked about most of these points. I'm just going to reiterate and emphasize the critical ones. Project module changes, we don't have a Spring Session jar anymore. We have Spring Session core instead, but this named Spring Session, it doesn't exist anymore. So if you're using that one in your dependencies, make sure to change it, because you might end up using either old Spring session or a mix of old and new. Because if you depend on Spring session jar, you'll only pick up 1.3.3, which is the latest one. And if you use on top of that Spring session data Redis, let's say, you'll end up with 2 point whatever is the latest, right? So take care of that. Also, if you're using MongoDB, the coordinates of this artifact have changed. It used to be data Mongo, it's now data MongoDB. Regarding core API changes, yes, we are aware that those were breaking changes. However, the recommended way to use Spring Session is to integrate with the existing higher level APIs, like HTTP session is for servlet support and web session is for Spring WebFlux. So this API is somewhat hidden in behind, so we used that fact to make changes to this API. If you do, however, have some custom interaction with session repository and session, you'll need to adapt that code to the API changes. And also you need to adapt to session resolution changes. As we mentioned that we've renamed sessions, HTTP session strategy to HTTP session ID resolver. As a part of this, the old HTTP session strategy had multiple responsibilities. Outside of correlating user requests with sessions on server side, it also provided support for having multiple user sessions in a single browser instance. Did anyone use some of that? No? Okay, lucky us then. But there's an open ticket to reintroduce that functionality. So if you're interested in it, feel free to vote on it. Okay, now we'll quickly gonna discuss what it takes to provide a custom session repository. As we mentioned, we no longer have the goal of providing all the possible session repository implementations within the Spring session itself. So we encourage the community to provide their own custom extensions, and we're going to try to explain how simple it is to do so. The Spring session, its core was made with extensions in mind, so it's simple to reuse. You have this in a similar manner, like with enable Redis HTTP session, you have enable Spring HTTP session. What is it behind this annotation is only core functionalities are registered. So this annotation, coupled with your manual declaration of session repository bean, is enough to get you going. So regarding implementing custom session repositories, there are a couple of important points to note if you decide to do so. First one is beware of the race conditions. Obviously, like I said, interaction with session repo occurs several times during the life cycle of HTTP request, and it is of vital importance for session repository store to be as performant as possible. And also, this especially applies to writes scenario, that when you actually persist the session to store. What we do with most implementations is that we track the delta of the changes to session. So when you use HTTP session, for example, set session and set attribute to a session, we track the change that you've done. So when save is invoked on the session repository, we don't persist again the entire session. We only save this delta, this attribute that you've altered, together with what's other thing likely to be changed last access time, right? So this arrangement reduces the possibility of race conditions in highly concurrent environments with multiple users. So take care of that if you have some higher performance requirements for your application and you're using custom Spring Session repository. Also take care to actually purge the expired sessions from the underlying data store, because if you just leave them behind, your data store will perform, its performance will decrease, right? And finally, if you're interested, you can also provide support for features like session event publishing, if possible, depending on the data store that you are using. Obviously, the major data store that we use, like Redis and Hazelkite, they have some publish subscribe capabilities in them, so we can provide HTTP session events. On the other hand, with JDBC, we have no such capabilities, and JDBC store doesn't support events. And also, finally, provide custom configuration classes. Like we said, registering a bean together with @enable Spring session, Spring HTTP session annotation is enough, but why don't make things possible for reuse? So if we have time, we'll take a look at the final demo very quickly. Okay, so the dependencies for these final demos only consist of Spring Session core, right? That's all that we'll need, and we'll use this demo to show the typical arrangement. For example, if you are using our own convenience map session repository, which is intended for testing and scenarios like that, this is all that you need to do. So @enable Spring HTTP session and register map session repository bean. Right. We're running short of time, so I'm going to skip running this part, and we're going to go straight to what you need to do in order to supply a custom, configuration for your custom session repo. Obviously, you need a @enable annotation. So this can look like something like this. Enable custom HTTP session. So we are declaring one attribute, which is max inactive interval, like session TTL, and we have to import the dedicated configuration class. So in this session class, what we do, important thing, we extend the Spring HTTP session configuration, which consists all the core. If you are extending reactive, you are then extending Spring Web session configuration, right? This is important. By doing this, you reuse all the infrastructure from Spring Session, which is shared across all the session repo implementations. We also implement import aware. Why? Because we need to be able to pick up the attributes from the previously described annotation and be able to configure our session repo using those, right? So once we do this, we should be able to remove this @enable Spring Session annotation, remove bean declaration, and simply replace this with @enable custom, and let's say max inactive interval of 5 seconds, right? So once we do that, we can start the app. Okay, it works. And now we can log in. Okay, we've logged in. We've set session TTL to 5 seconds. So if we wait long enough, 5 seconds, it's not too long, and we refresh, we should be greeted by a login page again. And this is what just happened. So it's if you have implemented your custom session repository, please strongly consider providing this configuration support and share it with the community. Like I said, we promote this through our dedicated section in reference manual. Okay, if you're interested in contributing, of course, visit our issue tracker. We also have Gitter chat, Stack Overflow tag, and if I didn't bore you enough, now you can take a look at my session from last year's Spring I/O. The talk name is From Zero to Open Source Hero. It provides some nice tips on contributing to Spring projects. So if you decide to contribute your custom session repo to the community, please do. Okay, since you all shown interest in Spring Session, I'd like to point you to some of the related talks. Spring Session connects several aspects, like web, like data access, like security. So having that in mind, I can recommend the following talks. Under the hood of reactive data access, coming right next up in this very room, And tomorrow morning at 9, we have Spring Boot 2 web applications. This is focused on Spring WebFlux and reactive. And to finish off the conference, tomorrow at 5, we have next generation of support with Spring Security 5. Okay, any questions? Will anyone contribute custom session repository? No? Okay, thanks.